Hi, kumusta na po kayo diyan? This is Art. Sa mahabang pagsusuri ng dalawang ahensya ng Biden administrasyon, FBI and Department of Energy, dito po sa Amerika ay napag-alaman po nila na itong coronavirus or COVID-19 na siya naman pong pumaslang sa milyong-milyong tao sa buong mundo ay galing po sa Wuhan, China. Para malaman pa po ninyo ang iba pang detalyahe ay sama-sama po nating panoorin ang video na ito.
This is the so-called wet market in Wuhan in China, where many still believe the coronavirus spread from animals to humans in late 2019. And this is the science lab just streets away that others are convinced was the actual source of the virus, created deliberately for research but leaked unintentionally into the world. Despite the fact COVID-19 has now killed nearly 7 million people globally, no one has been able to prove without doubt either theory.
What is the determination by the FBI?
Ito nga pala si Christopher Wray, isa sa mga mataas na tungkulin sa FBI. Pakinggan natin siya.
Now, one of America's top intelligence chiefs has overnight publicly stated his belief on camera for the first time.
The FBI has for quite some time now assessed that the origins of the pandemic are most likely a potential lab incident in Wuhan. So here you're talking about a potential leak from a Chinese government-controlled lab that killed millions of Americans, and that's precisely what that capability was designed for.
The lab in question in Wuhan did carry out research, including on coronaviruses, but China has always denied the lab leak theory and reacted with anger to the FBI chief today. We urge the US to respect science and facts, stop politicizing origin tracing, stop turning origin tracing into something about politics and intelligence. The FBI director's comments come at a time of mounting tension between the US and China over spy balloons, trade and the...
Kahit tulad nito, yung mga spy balloon, ngayon alam mo, natatakot na, walang takot ngayon ng China sa Amerika dahil alam nila na ni Xi Jinping na walang gagawin si Biden, ano man ang gawin niya. Ituloy natin.
Possibility, again, according to US intelligence, that China is contemplating sending weapons to Russia for use in Ukraine. They also come just days after the Department of Energy here in Washington, D.C. concluded that COVID-19 most likely originated inside a lab in China. Though the White House has been at pains to say there is still no government-wide agreement as to how the virus began.
The President made trying to find the origins of COVID a priority right when he came into office. And he's got a...
Itong sinasabi nito, ito hindi totoo yan. Si Biden walang kaalam-alam sa mga ginagawa nila. Sila lang nagsasalita nito. Ituloy natin.
Whole of government effort designed to do that. There is not a consensus right now in the U.S. government about exactly how COVID started. There is just not an intelligence community consensus.
The World Health Organization visited Wuhan in 2021.
Katulad nitong World Health Organization, ito'y binili na si Jinping. Alam ng World Health Organization kung saan galing at kung paano talaga kumalat ang COVID. Itinatago na rin nila. Tuloy natin.
Concluded that the virus made a natural jump from animals to humans, saying that it considered the lab leak theory to be highly unlikely. But there were questions at the time about the freedom given to its investigators by the Chinese government, and requests to return to Wuhan were reportedly denied. A report today even suggested the WHO had quietly shelved the second phase of its investigation, though an official denied the claim, insisting we have not and we will not abandon studying the origins of COVID-19. A study that many believe could take years to reach a definitive conclusion, if one can ever be found.
As we told you, Li Mengyang was one of the first people to tell the truth in the United States at great personal cost. She was there. She joins us now. Doctor, thank you so much for coming on. You said 3 years ago that you believe that this virus was intentionally released by the government you once worked for, the government of China. Today we're hearing in this leak to the Wall Street Journal that it was accidental. Do you believe this leak was accidental or intentional?
Hi, Tucker. Thank you for having me again. First, I really want to
Ito naman si Dr. Liman yan, isa sa mga scientist na kasama ng mga nagre-research dito sa laboratory dito sa Wuhan, China. Tumakas lang siya doon 3 years ago. Pero tuloy natin.
Appreciate you and also Fox News have been taking so much efforts pursuing the truth of COVID origin. Without your help, there won't be such milestone achievement. And I want to tell, of course, it was not an accident. And maybe for people who don't have this kind of biosafety lab 3 or 4 experience on coronavirus, maybe it's easy for them to accept the accident and lab leak. However, I'm the scientist working in such lab using coronavirus, and I can tell you, based on the protocol and also the other surveillance system, it will be impossible for the lab leak accidentally happen in such lab and cause the Wuhan outbreak and also the pandemic. So definitely, now we just reached to the first step. It was from China's lab, and we need to pursue the truth of origin, and we need to keep going on.
We know the Chinese government allowed its infected citizens to travel in huge groups to Western Europe in the early days of the pandemic. That was intentional. But you believe the whole thing, they came up with this virus and they unleashed it on the world to destroy the Western economies and to elevate their own position globally.
I want to emphasize one thing is, I would say, based on the evidence and the source I have, that the lab, virus was intentionally brought out of this strict lab and released in the community. However, I don't think the outbreak in Wuhan was intentional. I would say it was because CCP government and the military scientists underestimate the transmissibility. That's why finally it got out of control and caused the local outbreak. However, we should know that CCP government intentionally to let it go all over the world to kill millions of people all over the world later.
Here now with reaction, Texas Senator Ted Cruz. Senator, you were one of the few out there warning, seeing the evidence that was coming in, that this, in fact, came out of this lab. It made sense from the beginning, and they lied about it. They covered it up.
Well, Sean, that's exactly right. As I sit here and listen to those folks on TV and read those headlines, it makes me angry, because they're lying. They're deliberately lying. They knew they were lying. They are repeating the talking points of the Chinese Communist government. Democratic politicians were doing that, and the corporate media was doing that. It has been evidence. The overwhelming weight of the evidence for over 2 years now has been that this virus escaped from a Chinese government lab. And what's happened this weekend is we now have the bombshell report that not one but 2 agencies in the Biden administration have concluded the coronavirus came, the COVID-19 virus came from a Chinese government lab. Number 1, the Biden FBI has concluded that. And number 2, this weekend, we learned their reports that the Biden Energy Department has concluded COVID-19 came from a Chinese government lab. Now, I can tell you, more than 2 years ago, in March and April of 2020, on my podcast, Verdict with Ted Cruz, that we put out every week, I laid out the evidence then that it was obvious this came from a Chinese government lab. Let me point to 3 facts that are compelling. Number 1, the Wuhan Institute for Virology, which studies not just viruses, studies coronaviruses, not just coronaviruses, coronaviruses derived from bats, is located just a couple of 100 yards from the wet market where this outbreak first occurred in Wuhan, China. By the way, those bats don't occur naturally in China any closer than 900 miles away, and yet a few hundred yards from the lab, that's where the outbreak occurred. Data point number 2. In November of 2019, before the pandemic, 3 separate researchers at the Wuhan Institute for Virology were hospitalized, went and checked themselves in for serious ailments that suggest that they may have been the very first people with COVID-19. In fact, that might have been how it escaped. Fact number 3, after the pandemic began, the Chinese government actively destroyed the samples at the Wuhan Institute for Virology, destroyed them, and they also disappeared the whistleblowers. Now, I'll tell you, in a court of law, if you're facing a subpoena and you go and destroy evidence, you can be held liable for that. But not only that, the judge will instruct the jury to draw an inference against you that if you're destroying evidence, it's because the evidence demonstrates your guilt. In this instance, the fact that China's first reaction was get rid of all the evidence shows that they knew, they covered it up. China bears the responsibility, and the entire corporate media, CNN, MSNBC, all of the alphabet soup, the Washington Post, the New York Times, not only did they not cover this, they eagerly repeated the Democrat talking points and the talking points from the Chinese Communist government. It was dishonest and profoundly corrupt.
Senator, we know that China lied. We know that we fund the WHO. We give them a fortune, millions and millions of dollars. They lied. We know that our own government got it wrong about masks. We know they got it wrong about vaccines. Everything they told us turned out not to be true. How could we ever trust them again?
Look, Sean, that is a huge problem. You know, you look at Dr. Fauci. There is no bureaucrat in the history of our country who has done more damage to the United States than Dr. Anthony Fauci. Number one, his recommendations resulted in shutdowns that hurt tens of millions of kids, destroyed millions of jobs, millions of small businesses. And his willingness to set aside science, to set aside data, and to be purely political, there has been nothing in our lifetimes that has done more to damage the credibility of government scientists or doctors than Dr. Anthony Fauci. There are now tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of Americans that are not going to believe the next thing a scientist or doctor working for the government says. And that's dangerous. If, God forbid, we have another pandemic, let's say we have something like Ebola that has massively high fatality rates. I want us to be able to have scientists and doctors that can give us advice on how to keep our families safe. And yet Fauci was so willing to listen to the teachers union, so willing to listen to the Biden White House, so willing to put politics above science, that he has done enormous damage to the credibility of the government doctors. I think that's an incredible disservice to the country.
Sana'y nagustuhan po niyo itong video na ito. At sa muli po, ako'y magbibideo pa ng maraming hindi nyo nalalaman na nangyayari dito sa Amerika. Hanggang dito na po lamang. Ito po si Art. Maraming pong salamat.